Hey folks, Eddie from Totally Wired Guitars here, and today we're going to be taking a look at this 1969 Fender Jaguar. So I was very excited to get this thing in the shop recently, brought to me by a brand new client who had found me through the Offset Guitars forum. Shout outs to the awesome community over there. It's been a while since I've actually had a late 60s Jaguar in the shop. Not only was I tasked with doing some much needed maintenance on this thing, especially because this was a pawn shop find, but I was also tasked with verifying whether this is indeed all original. We're going to be doing things a little bit differently today because I filmed this teardown, so you get to see my live reactions as I begin to uncover what's going on with this guitar. And then we will come back afterwards, do a couple of playthroughs of the guitar, and I will give you just my overall assessment of whether or not this vintage 1969 Jaguar ended up being worth it, whether you should be on the hunt for a vintage Jaguar, and how they compare to modern reissues and also custom builds that I have played, because I think that that's valuable information to know, especially because the prices in the vintage market have been going up and up and up. So anyway, let's go ahead and get right into it, and I'll be back after the teardown. So starting off, we've got the original nitro over polyester or polyurethane finish. They switched to that after the CBS takeover, and you can see that that nitro top coat has cracked and checked very nicely over the course of the past 50 plus years in existence. Second, we have the gorgeous celluloid nitrate torque guard. It's got that gooey, lava-y, dark, fiery kind of pattern to it that you don't really see in most modern production pick guards. Also for 1969, we've got the staggered pull pieces on the gray bobbin Jaguar pickups. Now moving along to one of the biggest hallmarks of the later 60s Jags is the gorgeous blocks and binding neck. In the later 60s, Fender switched to the black logo with the gold trim, unlike the gold logo of the pre-CBS and even transition era. A couple more details before we go under the hood. You'll also notice in the later 60s on the original threaded saddle style bridges that the little bump that used to be much more pronounced in the early 60s is now more flat here and more reminiscent of modern day Jazzmaster and Mustang bridges. This one did have the mute pre-installed. I believe this foam has been replaced at some point just due to the fact that it is still quite spongy and not super compressed, but it was not installed properly, so I fixed it to have that satisfying click that a properly operating mute should have. Now, it's been a minute since I've looked at vintage Jag, but I did notice that the tops of the domed screws that hold the pivoting plate underneath this tremolo here are flat, which is a curious discovery because it seems that they were trying from the factory to address a common issue on, especially on improperly set up Jazzmasters and Jaguars, which is that some of your strings, unfortunately, the winds of those strings end up rubbing up against these, which can lead to string breakage and unwanted noises and stuff. So that's a cool little detail to find here. So moving on to underneath the hood, we have got the original stack pole made pots, 1 meg in value for both of these. We've got a treble bleed going on here. And if we take a look at that date, you'll see that 3046617 means these pots were made in the 17th week of 1966. And so even though this is a 1969 Jaguar, CBS bought a shit ton of pots in 1966, and you will commonly find these 1966 pots well into the 70s. Additionally, you'll notice that Fender started to use in 1969 the plastic coated wiring instead of the fully cloth covered leads they had been using previously. This one is a hybrid somewhat. You'll see this cloth covered lead to the input jack, whereas the ground is plastic coated. And you will see this as well under the rest of the circuit, with the exception being the leads on the pickups themselves, which are still cloth covered. Now, a quick look underneath the pick guard shows that this celluloid nitrate has turned into this mint green color, which is common for this kind of material this old. And you'll also notice the aluminum pick guard shield is intact. Also under the hood, you'll notice the original brass shielding and even the original foams still intact. I saw these numbers, 219. Not sure what those mean. I haven't seen those before. Now, removing the neck, we notice in the neck pocket that this is indeed the original 3-tone sunburst finish. And we've also got one of those neat little fiberboard shims. These were installed from the factory, and this one here is red. They also came in black. This one was about 0.5 millimeters, similar to that of a red Dunlop pick. Moving on to the neck stamp on the heel of the neck, we start off with the number 15, which is the signifier for Fender Jaguars, starting from 1966 to the end of production. Next, we have April, and then 69 for the year, and a B for B with neck. This was the most common and standard size Jaguar neck, and referred specifically to the nut width, which in this case was 1 5/8 inches. Now, going back to our beautiful bound and block inlay neck, you can notice the awesome detail of these now aged pearloid block inlays. We've got the black side dots, a little bit bigger than the dots used on the unbound necks. And this fretboard is indeed that gorgeous, rich, dark Brazilian rosewood, which is the creme de la creme of rosewood fretboards. If you aren't in the know, you see some pitting over time that you don't really see on most modern necks. And it's just got this really rich, dark, almost ebony-like color to it, which is just fucking Now, very common for an instrument of this age, you will see as you move up the neck, due to probably a number of fret levelings that this has needed, that the frets become flatter and lower as you move up. Unfortunately, there's not even enough fret there for me to crown these really flat, scratchy looking frets, but this thing is probably going to need a refret sometime in the not too distant future. So we are just going to leave it as is for now. One other detail that is commonly seen in binding this old are little cracks Thankfully, the kinds of binding that Fender was using is a lot more stable than the binding that I've seen on Gretches, for example, which are prone to rotting. The binding on this seems fairly stable, not crumbling at all, and this little crack here doesn't seem to be shifting much. Moving on to the back of the guitar, you see more of that weather checking on that lacquer over poly sealer finish. Some of it has rubbed away, most likely from belts. We have the original F-style neck plate with the serial, and someone had scratched some numbers into it for some reason. Now, I found the finish on the neck to be a little puzzling because it seems to be completely clean. It feels a lot like necks on modern poly finished Fenders, and it could very well be that the neck on this particular guitar is completely finished in poly or polyester because it is in damn good shape for its age. Either this thing was a closet queen, and if this isn't polyurethane, then they really put on the lacquer coatings quite thick because I do not see any evidence of checking or the extreme wear that we are seeing on the body. And in the late 60s, Fender started producing these F-style tuners, doing away with the Kluson single and double line oval button tuners they'd previously used. We do see a little bit of wear at the end, probably from knocking into something, but it does show you how thick that finish really is. And in fact, I'm even more convinced that perhaps this is a completely poly finished neck because this is when Fender started to actually shoot poly over the decals, unlike they had done in the pre-CBS and even transition era. You can see there's no finish checking at all on that headstock. That was pretty fascinating. There was a couple of things that took me by surprise. Aside from the vintage patina of this guitar, the neck has a quite modern feel to it because of that suspected poly finish that it has on it. It's very different from earlier 60s to mid 60s necks that I have played that definitely have lacquer finishes on them. Those ones are a lot more well-worn feeling. They sometimes have more of a matte finish or a satin finish to them, and they're not as consistent as the neck on this guy. If you like a glossier neck and you like kind of a chunkier, fuller profile, a late 60s Jaguar is definitely going to be up your alley. Now, these pickups surprise me because there's just something to vintage pickups that is very hard to describe. They've got almost a bordering microphonic kind of sound to them that I haven't really heard in even the best modern recreations. They sound more open, they sound fuller, they don't sound as aggressive, which I think makes the tone of this guitar very unique to the era that it was produced. Now, whether or not your audience is going to hear that at your show or on your recordings is up for debate, obviously, but for when you are playing the guitar at home through an amp by yourself or through headphones if you're recording, it definitely has a very special feel and sound to it that is hard to put into words. Now, the rest of my experience with this guitar is that it was in shockingly good shape. Yes, the frets are worn, as I've mentioned before, but aside from that, it didn't really need anything aside from a good setup. My client did specifically request that we put flat wound strings onto this guitar. It definitely helped, especially with some of the annoyances that people have with the original threaded saddle bridge. If you've been on the offset oriented internet, you've seen probably in comment sections and on forums and threads, people shutting down newbies who are complaining about the original threaded saddle bridge, telling them to just throw a set of flat wounds on there. And I'm here to tell you that there actually is some truth to that. They do tend to have less of some of those unwanted metallic noises, buzziness, and just give you more string tension and a warmer tone, because this bridge actually was designed with those heavier flat wound strings in mind. Now, that said, with a good setup, you can use whatever kind of string you want. I definitely, at minimum, do recommend 11s, but with a really good setup, you can get away with 10s. And then one revision that I do need to make to the comment that I had made earlier was that we did need to replace the foam after all. That looked, after taking it off, it did look like the original foam. It had been more compressed than I thought. And even with the mute set up properly, unfortunately, it was too low to actually be able to mute all of the strings when the bridge was set to the proper 7¼ radius. But that's the only thing that we needed to replace on this guitar, aside from this tremolo arm. Now, one thing of note for folks who buy a vintage Jaguar or Jazzmaster that did not include the original arm, yes, the American Vintage or the American Vintage reissue arms do work, some better than others. The one that I had installed onto here is one from around 2018. There definitely have been some changes made to tremolo arms that Fender is currently producing. Some of them have issues where they're a little bit too long and end up knocking into the bottom of the tremolo or vibrato route. And it did take me going through 3 different tremolo arms before I could find one that would fit in here. So it is going to be a bit of a hunt. And my recommendation definitely is, even though it's going to be more money than any of us would ever want to spend for a goddamn tremolo arm, buying one from the era that your guitar was produced in is definitely going to be the best fit. This one is getting a little bit of that sort of diving board phenomenon, vibrations that you don't usually get when you have a, properly spec'd tremolo arm for your specific unit, but you definitely can make a more modern one work. all of that being said, this thing is a hell of a player. It is very, very stable overall. It feels fantastic. It is pretty lightweight for a Jaguar. Yes, in the later 60s and into the 70s, Jags got heavier and heavier over time, but this one is right around that 8-pound mark, which is fantastic and considered light for a Fender Jaguar, especially from this era. So, is a vintage Jag right for you? If you've been paying attention to prices in the vintage offset market, you'll know that it has gone absolutely bananas over the past 5 or so years. Specifically, prices have gone up. A lot of sellers asking prices that most people are actually not paying for them. So, regardless of the sticker shock that you might see on marketplaces like Reverb and eBay, my suggestion is definitely to go ahead and make those offers. Take a look at the sale history and sale prices of these things and not just the listing prices, because in a lot of cases, especially for refinish ones, you could actually get yourself a vintage Jaguar right around the $4,000 range, which, yes, I know that is definitely still more money, about twice or even 3 times as much as what you need to get yourself a good quality Jaguar. But that said, obviously, vintage instruments are for a niche player, right? They are definitely not for everyone. Are they worth $2,000-$3,000 more than, $1,000 Jag that you can get out there? That is definitely going to be up to you and your budget. Is there something special to vintage Jags? Absolutely. Especially if you get one of the earlier 60s to mid 60s examples, there is just a feel to them. Those worn in lacquer necks, those are incredible. The late 60s ones, like these ones, also are fantastic. I feel like they are a good balance between having that road worn appeal, but also they've got this sturdier finish on the neck. So it's going to be solid for probably many, many more decades to come. This one, as I mentioned before, uh, has almost no wear or checking or anything on it. I think so long as you can bring your vintage instrument, if you don't know how to work on your own guitars, if you can bring it to someone who is knowledgeable about offsets, you should have absolutely no concerns buying one. Just make sure that you are buying from a reputable seller, because a lot of times marketplaces like your eBays and Reverb cannot always be depended upon if you end up with something that is not exactly what was described in those original listings. Anyway, I think that about does it for this guitar. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it educational, especially if you are on the hunt for a vintage Fender Jaguar. If you haven't already, please do like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell to be notified of new videos as soon as they drop. And as always, don't forget to follow Totally Wired Guitars for more offset guitars buying tips.